Good morning, everybody. I'm Marian Joyce. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the worship associate this morning. Good morning to all of you, and let me introduce Dr. Dan Jurman, who is giving our homily this morning and worshiping with us. It's lovely to have you, Dan. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this progressive spiritual community where we come together to nourish the spirit, connect in love, and act for justice. At UUCL, as we like to refer to ourselves, love is our only doctrine, and service and justice are our most sacred prayers. So we pray by striving to live in words and deeds that affirm that Black Lives Matter. And our doctrine of love has moved us to affirm for decades that love is divine and love is what makes a family. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are from, no matter who you love or how you experience and express gender in your body, you are welcome here. You're welcome to journey and grow with us as we explore and practice what it means to live lives filled with love. We gather in community because we need each other, because we know that we all carry a piece of wisdom and truth. We gather in community and we come here, people of many ages at many different stages in life, people of varying experiences, identities, and backgrounds, to share our truths with each other. And in the process, we weave a beautiful tapestry of spiritual community. So whether you believe in nature, in love, God, or science, or some combination of all of these things, whether you are content to let the great mystery just be, or whether your truth is a different truth altogether, you are welcome here. We warmly welcome anyone who is new here. We know that entering into a spiritual community as a newcomer can be intimidating. We are so glad you are taking the brave step of checking us out. We hope you will feel connected to what goes on here, even though through the screen and across distance and digital space. We hope you will find folks to chat with during one of our breakout rooms after the service. And we hope we will get to meet you someday in person. If you'd like to find out more about what goes on here, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter by visiting our website. I now invite us to enter sacred space as Dan says the words, and I will light our chalice, beloved symbol of our Unitarian Universalist movement.
We gather at a time of great turmoil, but also at a time that symbolizes light in the darkness. At this time, the beginning of Hanukkah, let us gather to worship and bring our own light into the darkness.
Thank you. And now we will sing together hymn number 119, Once to Every Soul and Nation.
Once to every soul and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side. Then to stand with truth is noble when we share its wretched crust, ere that
Let us come together now in a moment of prayer, meditation, and intention. Today I read to you the words of Nelson Mandela on despair from his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death.
Good morning. Now we invite everyone to examine their own heart and spirit. How are you today? Are you overflowing with joy? Are you weighted down by sorrow? Are you muddled in complexity? Community is a space where we can bring our complexities, seek authenticity, seek comfort, seek our joy, share our joys, and make meaning of all that life brings. This is our well. It can hold all of our stories. You were invited to share your story. If you need the help of the community, or if you want someone to celebrate with. It's your story, not somebody else's, unless you've been asked to share. And you can type it into the chat in 15 words or less. Before you can type from and your name, if you want us to say your name, or you can leave it anonymous. I will put in the first shell in appreciation for everybody here today, for Dr. Dan for doing our homily and our service with us, and for all the tech team behind the scenes that make this happen for us. We hold all these thoughts and the unspoken words and thoughts here together. And now Dr. Dan will do the reading.
Our reading this morning is an excerpt from a letter from a Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. From the Birmingham jail, where he was imprisoned as a participant in nonviolent demonstrations against segregation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in longhand the letter from which I'll share the excerpt that follows. It was his response to a public statement of concern and caution issued by 8 white religious leaders of the South. And now the reading. Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Perhaps I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true ecclesia and the hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany, Georgia with us. They have gone down the highways of the South on torturous rides for freedom. Yes, they have gone to jail with us. Some have been dismissed from their churches, have lost the support of their bishops and fellow ministers, but they have acted in the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in these troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Here ends the reading. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back with you again, even if it is virtual. I will share that this is my first virtual sermon, and so I will do my best. When we were preparing for today's service, Marion reminded me that the last time I had the opportunity to deliver your Sunday message was the last time you held in-person services. And I checked, it was back on March 8th of 2020. The week after that, I was told to take home whatever I would need from my office to be able to work from home for a couple of weeks. Now here I sit with all of you, broadcasting from the same room that I've been working from since that day. With all of the potential interruptions, worried about my children photobombing me and the dog barking at the UPS guy or the Amazon guy. So much has happened over this time. It's been 20 months that will certainly stand out in American history. When I last joined you and spoke about poverty, prejudice, and trauma, and the need for us to build real relationships with others to overcome all 3 of those, I didn't realize that every one of us would experience trauma in the months that would follow. That racism and hatred would spike in America, as well as right here in Lancaster County, and that our economy would be turned upside down. Truly, over the past 20 months, we've all felt the impacts of these sometimes horrifying times, but none have been impacted more than those who were the most vulnerable before the pandemic hit. It's staggering when we stop to think about all of it. 770,000 people dead from COVID so far, with a new, more contagious variant of the virus hitting the news this very weekend. The thought of something worse than the Delta variant or something resistant to our vaccines is more than most of us can process right now. We live in a county that has consistently led our region in COVID cases, with political leaders who have defied and downplayed public health orders since the start of this emergency. We can't even begin to calculate all of the short and long-term costs of our divided response to this virus. I recently saw a report that estimated that Lancaster County has added between 300 and 400 orphans due to COVID-19 deaths. The pandemic has left us overstressed and exhausted. The politicization of the pandemic has left us at each other's throats about public health guidance, adding even more stress, fear, and danger to an already dangerous and deadly situation, making both the pandemic and our politics worse. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery have put a fine point on the systemic, targeted, and casual racism that are endemic in our society. People took to the streets in historic numbers in 2020 to protest police violence and demand justice for people of color. That too was racialized and portrayed as riots and violence that, according to some, should cause people, especially white people, to feel fear for their safety. Any examples of violence or lawlessness that occurred during the protests were attributed to the whole in order to politicize and invalidate the core concerns of those protesting. We saw lots of old tropes wearing new clothes. The politicization of this too made both our racial tensions and our politics worse. Here in Lancaster, we saw the fatal police-involved shooting of Ricardo Munoz, a man who desperately needed mental health services, not an armed confrontation with police. Just a few weeks later, we saw the almost identical fatal police-involved shooting of Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia. While these cases were close to home, we know they were just the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, honest attempts to reform policing by adding behavioral health workers for appropriate responses have also been politicized and branded with the defund the police moniker to score political points. Racists and white supremacists have become more active and brazen in recent years. These groups are recruiting at alarming rates. In fact, the time from exposure to radical ideas to full radicalization in the United States has fallen from 6 months to 3.5 months. These issues also hit close to home, unfortunately. In addition to a long-standing KKK presence in southern Lancaster County, we now know of the rally last year in a historic barn on Millersville Pike, just outside Lancaster City, that announced the creation of a white nationalist group called the National Justice Party, a group founded on hate. While some of our religious and political leaders spoke out against hate in our community, its signs persist. This past Friday night, someone vandalized the menorah in Penn Square here in the city. And whether their motivations were aligned with white supremacists or not, the pain that act evokes certainly is. On top of these traumatic events, we just experienced one of the most contentious presidential elections in American history. The widely spread lies about fraud in the 2020 election, many of which were spread by our own elected officials as well as the highest office in the land, led to the violent storming of the Capitol on January 6th, as well as the need for law enforcement to confront and disrupt other would-be domestic terrorists in the months since. Again, this connects to our own backyard, as we know the FBI has revealed that the Oath Keepers met to plan their January 6 actions in Quarryville. These three toxic and stressful realities have created the environment for a series of other stressors as a result. Homicides are on the rise, with Philadelphia matching a 1990 record of 500 so far this year. We've had a record number of overdose deaths in the past 12 months, passing the 100,000 mark for the first time. Child abuse deaths in Pennsylvania were up in 2020 by over 30%, and several health groups have declared a national emergency for children's mental health. I fear an emergency in adult mental health is also a given, if we read all of the signs. These are the symptoms of a populace drowning in trauma and chronic stress, and I fear that the end is nowhere in sight. Above it all is the ever-present and existential threat of climate change and the cascading crises that get a little worse each year as a result. Given our response to the immediate threat of the pandemic, it becomes difficult to see how humanity could ever make the changes necessary to avert global disaster for the generations that follow us. Lives across the globe are already being changed and lost. Causes for urgency that are juxtaposed against what is essentially our collective inaction across the globe. It's a lot. It's too much, in fact. Depression and anxiety are running rampant, which is more than understandable. A friend told me that they reached out to their EAP at work and were asked if they were thinking of harming themselves or someone else. And when they answered no, they were told they'd get a call back in about 6 weeks. A lot of us are in pain. When we are surrounded and impacted by horrific events, it is okay not to be okay. In the midst of all of this fear and horror and pain, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed. And worst of all, to lose hope. But where do we find hope in times like these? So often, at least for me, The advice we can get in church can feel empty at times like this. So often, those who seek to give us advice in times like this can confuse hope with faith. Faith in a higher power can be a wonderful thing as we face a difficult time. But that faith should be independent of the outcome. For example, if the white supremacists who are working toward a new civil war succeed and this democracy crumbles, faith may be the only thing many of us have left. Faith can be that light we take with us into the dark when things don't work out. Hope, on the other hand, is embodied in the optimism that it will all work out. That the dark outcome can and must be changed. I would argue that the word work is key here. If things are to work out, I believe our work is required. Just as faith without works is dead, hope without works is just wishful thinking. Assuming some of you feel the same way that I do these days, tired, stressed, angry, afraid, outraged, sad. All the clinical symptoms of chronic, unrelenting stress, by the way. Assuming you feel that too, the last thing I want to do here today is just advise you to have faith, as important as that is, or just to trust that there's a plan, or to hold on to wishful thinking. Those words might actually make me feel worse if I heard them today. So instead, I'll try to be more practical than that and spend a bit of our time together talking about works, the things I believe we can all do to restore our hope for the future, and our hope in each other. It isn't a perfect list or an exhaustive list. The things I suggest might not even work for you. Holding on to hope may be more of a journey than a destination. But that just means it needs to be a regular, intentional practice and not just a passing thought. The first thing I'd suggest is centering ourselves. Times like these are filled with a lot of noise. Noise in the news, noise on social media, and even the noise of our own thoughts. Quieting that noise can look different for each of us. For some, it might be spending some time in nature. For others, it might be deep breathing or meditation. If the symptoms you're feeling have progressed far enough, I absolutely encourage you to reach out to a professional therapist. I have done that myself shortly before the pandemic to address the PTSD I experienced growing up in a house plagued by domestic violence. And it was life-changing. We have placed stigmas on both mental health and reaching out for help in this country. And I'm here to tell you those stigmas are nonsense and that they get in the way of our healing. It's okay to ask for help when you're not okay. My preferred method for centering myself comes from an old tradition of Catholic monks called centering prayer. It has a lot in common with meditation. You find a comfortable, quiet place to sit and invite your higher power to be present with you in the stillness. Then you gently, using the mantra of your choice, push any thoughts you have out of your head in an attempt to achieve complete stillness. It can be frustrating. You can maybe sometimes feel like it isn't getting anywhere. And in my own experience, every time I find the stillness, I realize that I found it, and then I start thinking things and I ruin it again. But it can be powerful. The monks believed that in those moments of perfect stillness, you were fully connected to the divine. I first learned about this technique at seminary, and not intentionally. I had taken a course on narrative therapy that was cut just a couple of days before the semester was set to start. The seminary told me that the only other available elective was a course on spirituality. And when I read about the course requirements to take a Sabbath every week and practice 15 minutes of centering prayer every single day, I said, you've got to be kidding me. I was a busy executive. I didn't have time for that. Doing anti-poverty work wasn't a full-time job, it was an overtime job. I figured I'd go to the first class since it was so soon and I didn't have much notice. And then I'd ask my advisor if I could do an independent study instead of taking the class. Now, to get ready for the first class, I had to watch a video on YouTube that explained what centering prayer was. And when I watched the video and heard the benefits of the practices and the thoughts behind it all, my immediate thought was, oh my, this is exactly what I should be doing as an overbusy, overworked, overstressed executive. That class became my favorite of my entire doctoral experience. After 2 weeks of practicing centering prayer for 15 minutes per day, I went into work one morning to find out we had a crisis on our hands. I listened to my team members tell me what had happened. Then I told them how I thought we should respond. Afterwards, one of my executive team members pulled me aside and asked me, "What are you doing?" And when I asked what she meant, she said, "You're so calm. What are you doing?" I knew immediately it was the centering prayer sessions. To this day, I still use centering prayer to center myself and let go of all the noise. If you're interested in checking it out or practicing meditation of any sort, we live in a world where Google and YouTube put free resources and guides in front of us at the speed of a search and a couple of mouse clicks. Whatever centers you, whatever feeds your spirit, I would encourage you to do it intentionally and regularly and not let it become an afterthought. At a time like this, we can't afford to be too busy to take care of our own spirit. You see, we each have our own separate capacities to handle stresses. And when we start the day with that cup half full, it doesn't take much for it to overflow. If we're going to get to a place of hope, it's going to be crucial to not be overwhelmed by the noise and the stress that comes at us day after day. The second thing I suggest is trying to push through to empathy. That is an easy thing to say and much harder to do. For example, when I encounter racism, it fills me with rage and pain. My father was Puerto Rican and my mother is a white woman from a working class family. She became pregnant with me in 1969 when she was just 16 years old. The first racist comments I ever heard came from people who were related to me. And it either didn't occur to them or it didn't matter that each word was like a cut. I later experienced racism in the community at large, but even getting my car searched from time to time, from glove box to trunk, and leaving each of those stops without a ticket didn't hurt as much as a word from a family member could. I came to see in time that the people who were the most racist in my family were also the most dysfunctional, the ones in the most pain and with the most unhealed trauma. The Department of Homeland Security has reported that over 40% of people who join violent extremist groups have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. These are the all too common emotional, physical, and sexual child abuses, as well as neglect and household dysfunctions like substance use, domestic violence, mental illness, or having an incarcerated parent. I personally have experienced 8 out of the 10 ACEs, as they're called, studied by the CDC, and can speak to the power they have to create lifelong pain. We know from the research from the Centers of Disease Control that adverse childhood experiences can lead to a multitude of negative physical and behavioral health outcomes. We also know that it can create fertile ground for racism and extremism. Recruiters look for damaged, disaffected people, those who feel like they have been aggrieved and forgotten, the outcasts who don't belong. The tactics of recruitment aren't that different than those used by cult leaders or street gangs. Add to that the internet, media personalities, and elected leaders, including those with national profiles and platforms who encourage extremist groups, who tell them that the other is coming for what's theirs, or that the other is the reason that they've lost what's theirs. And the acceleration and growth of these extremist groups is no mystery. I am no friend of racists. As a mixed person, I represent what many of them fear and hate the most. My children and I are abominations to them. But there is an old saying, hating someone is like swallowing poison yourself and hoping the person you hate will die from it. Hatred will not end racism and bring about the world we hoped for. If anything, hatred will just throw more fuel on the fire. And I'm not just talking about empathy for racists, but for everyone who is feeding the stressors that fill our days. I watched the events of January 6th in real time on my television. I despised everything I saw happening that day. But when you consider that every person storming the Capitol that day was just as stressed out as the rest of us are, I can at least understand their anger. They had been told by the people they trust that our democracy had been stolen, not that it might be, that it had already happened. I can't honestly say what I would do if the situation was reversed. I'd like to think I wouldn't hurt anyone. I wouldn't damage other people's property. But I would also like to think that I'd show up, that I'd make myself heard. I can disagree with what they did and how they did it, and even why they did it. But I can also understand it. And when I understand it, it becomes harder to hate them. And it becomes easier to feel sympathy and empathy for them. Even when it comes to those who deny the truth of what COVID-19 is doing to our communities, what it's doing to the world, I can find empathy. Again, if the people I trust are telling me that the virus is fake and it's just an attempt to take away my freedoms and grab power, it's part of some conspiracy, if I truly believe that, that would be terrifying. And the behavior that I find irresponsible and abhorrent is at least understandable. Much like the practice of finding the stillness, practicing empathy for those who hate us is a way of clearing the noise and the poison from within, so we can focus on the crucial work that lies before us. I would argue that loving our enemies is a crucial step in fomenting hope. Let me be clear. I have a harder time conjuring empathy for those who drive the false narratives, who use fear and resentment and anger and hatred to garner political power or profit or ratings. To me, that is where we must spend our energy, working against those who create and feed the toxicity that drive our divisions. Empathy doesn't mean a lack of action and resistance. It's not passive. Empathy means my actions come forward not only from an absence of hate, but from a place of love for all humanity and all creation. The next thing that I would suggest is exactly that, doing something. It doesn't have to be something big. Small things count, and they add up. But it should be something in the real world and not just the virtual one. We must find ways to resist the forces of toxicity that are feeding on our collective pain and trauma. Some of us may have it in us to march to show that Black Lives Matter or to counter-protest against white supremacists. We could show up this very evening in Penn Square to stand in solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Some of us may prefer to volunteer on the campaign of a candidate for public service who speaks to the better angels of our nature, who's a warrior for social justice, or who is committed to a green economy. Some of us might buy an electric car or put solar panels on our roofs, or make sure our 401ks only contribute to solutions and not to our problems. Some may write a check to a cause that champions justice. Some may write editorials. Some may just manage to get up, get out, and vote in every election. Some may do the hardest thing of all, loving our enemies, finding someone in pain and letting them know that someone cares, that they're not alone, that they do belong, that they can bring healing to themselves and the world instead of walking a path that creates more pain. When people walk that path, they don't just damage others, they do damage to themselves. Whatever we do, we must do something. That in and of itself is crucial. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, it's the action, not the fruit of the action, that's important. You have to do the right thing. It may not be in your power. It may not be in your time that there'll be any fruit. But that doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing. You may never know what results come from your action. But if you do nothing, there will be no result. Finally, I would encourage all of us to look to those purveyors of hope who came before us. In our meditation and reading today, I chose the words of two people whose shoulders we all stand upon when we dare to hope in dark times. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years by his oppressive government. He spent 18 of those years in a tiny cell, eating limited rations and doing hard labor in a lime quarry. Even in those conditions, he could still find room for hope, not wishful thinking. True hope that would require his works to realize. Dr. Martin Luther King wrote of optimism while sitting in a jail cell. With all the death threats and hatred that confronted him and his family every day, he could still hope and work to make that hope reality, even if it was a reality he wouldn't live to see. I think of Anne Frank and countless Jewish people who spent years hiding from the Nazis in poverty and squalor and in fear, and those who risked their own lives to hide and protect them. What else but hope could keep them working toward a better day in the face of such brutality and despair? In the face of such evil? And if they could find hope and the strength to work for a better day, how can we do anything less right here and right now? We are called to not give in to despair, no matter the odds, no matter the trials, because history tells us that every crisis comes to an end. Every despot falls. And in the words of the Unitarian minister, transcendentalist, and abolitionist Theodore Parker in 1853, look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, but from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. I would argue that it doesn't bend on its own. Indeed, I believe that bending towards justice requires all those of goodwill to push as their gifts and their strengths allow. We may all find the strength we need to push and hope in the days ahead. Amen.
Breathe in peace.
Thank you, Eli. Centering, breathing, empathy, hope. We will now take an offering as an outward expression of our interdependence. You can support our work as you are able by texting the amount of your donation to the number on the screen or through the Contribute tab on our website at UUCLonline.org. We share half of our offering this month with ADVAS, a nonprofit that uses mediation and restorative practices to build community and transform conflict.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth, keepers of faith, makers of peace, and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one.
Now go forward. Seek the stillness and your own healing. Act from a place of love with hope in your heart, and work to be a light in the darkness with the certainty that even right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Amen.